And throughout the rest of the 19th century, all those styles come, but the I house endures. To say it very simply, just as in the 1760s, Americans had already united and separated from England. In the 1830s, the South had already left the Union. And if you look across the southern landscape for any record whatsoever of the Civil War, you won't find it. Almost aggressively, the houses after the Civil War were based on antebellum models. Didn't lose the war, apparently, unfortunately. So what happened? Well, you changed a few details. You didn't want to seem like an idiot. You were getting the same agricultural magazines that people were dealing with, but you were taking tiny ornamental details and applying them to a box that just didn't change between 1760 and 1910. That's because architectural forms are about values, about social order. The people in the South simply wanted something different than the people in the North. There may have only been an accident that it seems that in the 1760s, Southerners and Northerners had unified around a Georgianized proposition of a symmetrical and enclosed house. But they did. But the South obviously took that as the way life ought to be, whereas in the North it seems that people took that as one of a series of fashions that demonstrated their buying power, perhaps. At any rate, this is a pattern. It's the pattern of the South. So if we look at the Virginia landscape, where what happened in Ireland in 1900 happened in 1760, and take another step out, let us say to England, then we find exactly the same change that I'm talking about happening, but not in 1760, in 1580. Once again, in advance of the Revolution. Before the English got it together in order to kill the king, perfectly good idea, they had already reorganized their domestic arrangements. You understand the argument already. That is that the first place that you're in control is your own hearth. And you begin to reconstitute the world from your hearth outward. And you might decide that there are neighbors that you no longer want to just walk into your house. There are neighbors that maybe you'd like to stop and make sure it's, the Mormon missionaries, it's the watchtower ladies, it's the people. Are we sure that all these people should be crashing right into the middle of our houses? Or maybe we stop them at the door and suggest that later, perhaps. But in an old open house of the kind that Ireland had until 1958 is when the last one was built, you can't stop anybody at the front door. They are inside and fed tea before you can even ask their names. That's a situation most of us would find quite uncomfortable. So we can't complain about our ancestors all the way back as early as 1580 deciding that the thing to do was to develop little locks, lobbies, intervening places, little spaces where people could be stopped and prevented from getting directly in their house. But where did that happen first? Well, in the English-speaking world, it happened first in southern England, and it happened right about 1580. It's amazing. And that was well before people then said, having organized the world again from anew, from my place of habitation, from the hearth that I keep warm, from the place where I serve people, later on we began to think about reorganizing the larger society. Later on we began to think about ideologies that would spread the proposition of difference from the hearth to the larger world. Later on we began to worry about warfare. Right now what we want is personal comfort. It's the reason why houses are way ahead of the written record in understanding the evolution of Western culture. Well, the ideas that were first developed in southern England, Sussex, Essex, in particular, Kent, into the 16th century, were of course in the 18th century consolidated in the Georgian. They weren't the consequence of the Georgian style, they were there before the Georgian style, but once this new house form, so symmetrical in its boxing, so symmetrical in its planning. Once this new house form had entered, it just was picked up by the impulses that were already there, and this became the form into which people poured their desires for separation and their desires for order. A kind of anxious desire for separation and a kind of optimistic desire for order. That's what this house means. It means fear and it means hope all at once. In England, it's called Georgian, which is a little arrogant, because the English house was in fact a version of a Dutch house, which was a version of an Italian house, which was a version of an Ottoman house. I mean, it's not hard to get back to where the origins of things are, the Eastern Mediterranean. But the house is everywhere in Europe, that symmetrical house. You're having to look at one from Potsdam in Germany, the worse for wear, but a perfectly typical mid-18th century house of the kind that you had everywhere from northern Italy to Northern Ireland. There was a massive unification. And this is not only a unification, it was a piece of massive cultural evolution. This is the moment of the birth of the modern. These houses allow you to date it. When did the modern world come in your community? You can date it by that moment when open houses were replaced by closed ones, asymmetrical houses replaced by symmetrical ones. That is to say, it's a change from the medieval world in which the essential proposition is a sacred community to a modern world in which the essential proposition is a secular nation. That's what this house is about. It spreads the Renaissance proposition of individualism, the Renaissance proposition of separation, of privacy, of prosperity, of wealth, of capitalism. This is the symbol of a great evolutionary change. But lest we get comfortable, it's not the world story, it's the Western story. And one of the terrible things that we are faced with in our time is trying to figure out a history that's authentically a world history. And what I've just sketched is a history that I think Fernand Braudel pretty much thought was a universal history, but it's a history very particularly of the world north and west of the Mediterranean. Just as a good example, come to a place very much outside that, the Thar Desert of Rajasthan, India. Completely different kind of environment than we've met before. In the Thar Desert, in the village of Dengri, the people who build houses build them entirely out of natural materials. This is a farmhouse from Dengri. Coming close to it, every bit of its materials are natural. That is, the walls are built of clay, the roof is thatched. This is the architect, Jetmal Singh Bhatti. It's a kind of vernacular ideal in that this is the man who built this house, and this is the man who lives in the house, and the man is a farmer, and he did it for himself. It's a kind of dream possibility of vernacular architecture. It's exceedingly rare in the world, anywhere. But here's an example of a man who built a house, built a beautiful house, used natural materials. It's sort of the vernacular ideal is represented to you by Jetmal Singh. He lives outside a city called Jaisalmer. Jaisalmer is in fact a very wealthy city. It was one of the nodes in the Silk Road in early times. It was the last rock in India before you headed into the general Persian world. So it's a rock that stands between the centers of Hindu India and the centers of the Muslim Middle East. Jaisalmer is a very wealthy town. It's a town with a very powerful sense of its own tradition. It's a result of the fact that it's been prosperous forever and is prosperous today. Here's a characteristic Jaisalmer house. Even from the outside, you can know something about it. One of the things you know is that the lower level is not really a living area. You just pass through it. It's a kitchen. There are no windows that serve that lower level. Instead, you have to go in and go into stairs, and what the stairs do is take you upstairs, and what the upstairs does is it bursts out of the wall. It has all these jetties, windows that are up there desperately trying to get into we're in a desert, desperately trying to catch a little air. But the two features of the house are also perfectly emblematic of the cultural complexity of the place, in that on the lower wall you paint an image of Lord Ganesh. Ganesh is the Lord of beginnings. And it's painted to announce a wedding in the house. So that on the lower level of the house, which is the kitchen in effect, you make a very clear Hindu sign, whereas the upper level of the house is entirely derived from Muslim tradition, from the traditions of especially Western Afghanistan and Persia. This is a city of trade. I mean, it is a city of trade. It's still a tremendous center for goldsmithing. Some of the finest jewelry in the world is made here. We're not talking about people eking out a living in the desert. We're talking about people who are at the center of trade between the East and the West, a still viable route of commerce that leads from the interior into India into the great Muslim Middle East. And Muslim designs have been brought back by traders to make the normal upper level of the house, whether owned by a Hindu or a Muslim.